Food sovereignty to me looks like when people bear witness to their food from seed to plate, where you have access to fresh and culturally relevant foods that remind you of home and make you, feel good. Growing food that's mutually beneficial to the land, I think, is also really important.
Yeah.
So really just when people have control over the kinds of foods they're eating and a say in how it's distributed.
You're now listening to In Praxis, a podcast from the Praxis Project created to support, hear from, and uplift the stories coming out of the ecosystem of base-building organizing, an ecosystem that includes frontline groups building community power and the folks who help support their important work. In Season 3, our host, Blair Franklin, is exploring community-driven strategies for food justice. Our guests are incredible community organizers working to advance fair farming practices, community-led urban farming, and equitable food procurement and retail. These are their stories about how we feed our communities with healthy, culturally appropriate, fair, and affordable food, and build community power to advance health equity through food justice.
Hello, I am with Angela Patel today, and we're going to talk about food sovereignty, food security, and community-driven food systems in the context of the Danny Wu Community Garden. And just jumping right in, I was wondering if you would mind telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. Hi, I'm Angela. I use she, her pronouns. I grew up in southeastern Minnesota. My ancestors are from South Asia, Madhya Pradesh on my father's side, and East Asia, like Manila and Kalibo area on my mother's side. So I identify as a second generation Pan-Asian American, and that really shapes the lens through which I see my work in the garden. In the garden, I work as a sustainable community program and educational coordinator, long title, but the Danny Wu Garden is an urban growing space in Seattle's Chinatown-International district, which is located on the ancestral land of the Duwamish Nation. And our intention is really to provide space for low-income Asian and Pacific Islander elders and youth to grow food and engage with the environment. We also want to preserve biocultural diversity in the garden and just create a space for people to connect with an equitable food system.
Wow. So what led you to doing food justice work?
Yeah, so I would say I'm pretty new to this scene, but my senior year in undergrad, I was doing a poverty studies interdisciplinary minor capstone project, and you had the choice of either doing research on an encampment in the neighborhood or doing a food justice project around focus groups for parents in the public schools area and how they access and obtain food. So I chose that one because it was just like more unknown for me at the time, and I really wanted to spend my senior year doing something different. So in that project, the focus group project, that really revealed climate and health injustices I had the privilege of not being exposed to before. For example, it's really hard to be diabetic at a food pantry, or there were floods happening. I went to school in South Bend, Indiana, so a lot of the floods would block access to different food pantries or different grocery stores even. And for those relying on public transportation, that, was a huge barrier. So just different things like that I hadn't thought about before left me curious about other factors affecting food systems.
Wow, thank you. And I'm just curious also, how long ago was that? So how long have you been doing this work?
Yeah, I graduated in 2018 and went straight to the garden after my senior year in an AmeriCorps position.
Nice. And when you first started, what did the food landscape look like?
Yeah, again, because it was only 3 years ago, not much different than it is now. I would say that there's more gentrification and displacement in the International District here. So grocery stores are a little bit more expensive, but otherwise we're not in like a food desert necessarily. There are a lot of different Asian-owned markets.
Mm-hmm. And were there any policies that led to divestment in food systems or food infrastructure at all?
So I wouldn't say there were divestment in food systems necessarily, but the cultural landscape has definitely been a direct result of policy change. The area was essentially, forced into existence by redlining and remnants of anti-Chinese sentiment following the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 actually voided previous restrictions and quotas. I think they allowed something like 2,000 immigrants from the continent of Asia to enter the US previously. After the 1965 reform, this allowed more refugees and, primarily Vietnamese refugees into the area. So we now have like a little Saigon. So policy has definitely shaped like the different neighborhoods within the International District.
That's really interesting. How do you think your community's relationship to food has changed or transformed as a result of this work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So before the garden, there was a Filipino American activist from the community. His name is Uncle Bob Santos. Well, they called him Uncle Bob for short. But he really noticed that a lot of the elders were living in single room occupancy units and were desperate for connection and were growing their own food. So he really organized a lot of other younger Asian activists to build this garden space. And I think because of it, people have a space to seek respite from the city and save money on food by growing their own food and connect to other people who speak their language. So I think, that community aspect has really been helpful for the community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you elaborated on this a little bit before when you were discussing exclusionary policies. And I know it's also very difficult to kind of group Asians and Pacific Islanders together because our histories are all very varied across the continent. But historically, what, if any, has been the impact of the legacy of slavery or occupation, so colonialism and imperialism, on food for our communities?
Yeah, so especially in terms of occupation, there's an absence of native foods here because of the displacement of the Duwamish people. And, I think one thing we've tried to do to bring that back into the space is partner with the Seattle Indian Health Board and given them, a space in the garden to steward. They really kind of, I think, turned it into a medicinal garden in some ways. There's salal and echinacea growing there. But yeah, again, going back to Uncle Bob, I don't know if you're familiar with the history of Seattle, but there was a activist group in the 60s and 70s, 1960 and 1970, called the Gang of Four, also referred to as the Four Amigos, I think. And it was really a partnership between different community leaders, Uncle Bob being the Asian American kind of movement leader. And then there was somebody representing the Black Power movement and the Native community here, and then also the Latin community. So really all four came together to build the garden and would show up for their own communities too. Yeah, so we try to keep it alive today. And, the grandson of somebody who helped build the garden, who identifies as Native, is in the garden right now actually helping build a tool shed through his organization. So it's really powerful to see that interracial solidarity still today.
That type of solidarity is so critical, and especially in working for food sovereignty and food security, kind of centering and focusing on Indigenous voices and descendants of colonized people is so critical. So that's really amazing to hear. Kind of a follow-up on the last question, what is the relationship between food and medicine and healing? And how does your work promote healing through food justice?
Yeah, so this is something I've been thinking about, especially through medical school. I actually just finished my first year and I'm here in the summer.
Congrats.
Over break, thank you. But I think that it has been most, physically apparent in, I'll give an example. Yesterday, we were trying to build a rain garden, and it's going to be like a dry bed rain garden with rocks. And so we were trying to clear this one area of the garden, and a gardener comes up and says, oh, like, no, don't pull those, what we thought were weeds. It's mugwort. It's a type of plant that they use for, GI pain or distress. So, there's medicine growing all around the garden, whether I can identify it or not. And that I say would fit into more like the Eastern traditional herbal medicine. And then there's more than just physical medicine. There's also, it's healing to be outside. In every gardener interview we've done about, why do you like coming to the garden? They always say, it's to keep me physically strong and mentally healthy. And it's really, powerful to grow your own food and see it through from seed to plate, really. So,
yeah, wow, it's wonderful. And how do you engage community through your work?
So I think you said it earlier, but Interim Community Development Association has many branches, and the garden is only one of them. We also have housing services and residential activation, providing different activities for elders in the community, like mahjong in the park or ping pong tournaments, things like that. And then there's also like a policy branch. But specifically in the garden, we try to engage community through working with different youth in the area. At our peak, when we had 5 staff, we were running 5 different programs per week, from BIPOC high schoolers to students at El Centro de la Raza, which is a preschool down the street, to 3rd and 5th graders coming from CISC, which is the Chinese Information and Services Center, also in the neighborhood. We would bring youth in, and ideally there would be gardeners passing on traditional land knowledge and engaging with the youth and, intergenerational knowledge sharing. And then we also have events. We try to open up the space to as many people as possible because it just feels, safer and more energizing when there's more people in the garden. So people will come and have their events. We just had a 3rd grade band party come in on this Saturday, which is really fun. And we did like a Juneteenth themed station. And then we have community volunteer days, which is, open invite, bring closed-toed shoes and a water bottle, and everybody kind of gets together. So that's another way. And then really there's a large transient population too that uses the garden because we are so centrally located and close to downtown. One of the efforts to do like a tea for trash situation. So we would bring out hot tea in exchange for if you wanted to help pick up trash around the garden, which we used to be doing close to 3 days a week. So those are different efforts we've had in engaging the community.
Yeah, very engaged. And what does food sovereignty look like for you?
Yeah, food sovereignty. I'm actually really proud to say I think we're headed in the right direction in the garden. Food sovereignty to me looks like when people bear witness to their food from seed to plate, where you have access to fresh and culturally relevant foods, foods that remind you of home and make you, feel good. Growing food that's mutually beneficial to the land, I think, is also really important.
Yeah.
So really just when people have control over the kinds of foods they're eating and a say in how it's distributed is what I would say food sovereignty looks like.
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. And what are the greatest barriers you experience to your work, and how do you typically overcome them and address them?
Yeah, we're always trying to address them. I would say one of the greatest barriers is the language barrier and dealing with symptoms of the housing and substance use crises. Language barrier in particular is easier to overcome by really investing in hiring locally and people with language abilities. I don't know if I said earlier, but almost everybody, actually all the gardeners, for all the gardeners, English is their second language, and if they speak English. And there's 7 different dialects spoken, so there's, Vietnamese, Japanese, Korean, mainly Taishanese and Cantonese, and then Mandarin as well. And so, I think it's easy to be fearful if you don't speak the language of another person. And so, again, with the housing crisis, if we have transient folks in the garden, I think gardeners are more inclined to build higher fences and call for help or be fearful. So I think that has been hard. Also in communication with the gardeners and finding what their needs are. And if there's an emergency and nobody's in the garden who speaks the language, it can be, very difficult. And again, we try to address that by hiring people who speak the language, trying to engage the community, both transient folks and gardeners, and then doing frequent trash pickups. Another thing that makes work in the garden difficult is like a scarcity mindset for a lot of the immigrants and refugees who use the garden. I think people are always fearful that there's not enough. And I think we try to address this by providing as equitable as we can of different plot distributions. So making sure everybody has like a similar amount of land to garden in. And then especially when we bring in compost deliveries, like making sure there's enough for each gardener. This is really hard to do. And there is a lot of like theft between gardeners that happens. But I think, the more resources we can provide and show that it's being distributed fairly is the best thing we could do.
Right. And showing a culture of abundance.
Yes. Yeah.
And how do you measure success?
One strategy that we use, it's what we do when we're trying to strategically plan for like the next year, for example, and where our goals are going to be and where we want our values to align, is a power map. Actually, it's an adaptation of a power map. Power mapping was traditionally used by political organizers, and we kind of took that model and made it into a resource map. So if you can imagine with me here for a second, on the x-axis would be how in line is a resource with your social justice agenda. And then on the y-axis would be power. And that is your degree of influence of the decision that you make. So what we would do is map different resources onto that grid, really, which would be like the gardeners and the youth and chickens, for example, and then like our board and our funding and different things like that. And so how we measure success is really when we can elevate the power of the resources that, are advancing our social justice agenda, which, again, going back to the mission of the garden, is providing a space for elders and youth, API elders and youth, and preserving biocultural diversity. So an example would be the gardeners trying to elevate their agency within the garden space and their control over their own food system, hiring an operations manager who is in the garden most days of the week, who speaks their language and was actually a son of one of the gardeners. So he really knew the community more intimately than we had previously. That really helped the gardeners have more say in what was happening in the garden. So that was successful in my mind.
Right, that's wonderful. And I love that power resource. I think that sounds so helpful to look at and to use. And it kind of reminds me of the concept of pod mapping and transformative justice circles, mapping out your community and your pods, which I think is also very wonderful. So if you had unlimited resources, what would you do to increase your impact?
Oh, I love this question. I feel like me and the previous garden manager love to, envision what it could be like if we had more resources. But I think number one of our dreams is to have a educational building in the garden with restrooms and electricity and water and showers. That would be amazing. And then it could also be partly a caretaker's residence. That would be one dream. And then secondly, I think about 2 years ago, they removed one of the bridges downtown and unfortunately found out that there are a bunch of rats living in the old bridge. And so they really dispersed into the neighboring areas, including the garden. It's like the perfect environment for rats. And so we really have a rat crisis right now. And so ideally, we would completely redo the chicken coop and pour in concrete floors. And somehow if we could just move the rats somewhere else, that would be...
Get them away from the garden.
Yeah, I think the gardeners and the youth would be really happy about that.
Understandably. Wow, that's wild that just moving the bridge could have such a huge environmental impact on all the surrounding areas. So what is one piece of advice you would give to someone thinking about starting an initiative like a community garden in their community?
One piece of advice? I wish I could just say one, but Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy is a book that me and the garden manager really used to frame our philosophy about community organizing and gardening. And one of the core principles of the book is to move at the speed of trust. I really like that philosophy, and everything is going to take 3 times longer than you think. So just having patience with any initiative is key.
Yeah, I love that book, and that concept specifically is so grounding. I think when it's easy to get kind of caught up in what seems like the urgency of all this work.
Right.
But really centering the community. Anyways,
Great.
Thank you. This was incredible. You were a wonderful podcast guest, and we so appreciate him to do this.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me. This was really fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of In Praxis. We hope you all enjoyed it. Make sure to visit our website, www.thepraxisproject.org, where you can check out additional episodes with other guests, as well as learn more about our work.